تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. Today then we come to the section of Wasitiyyah where Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala is going to talk about the attribute of Allah, the face of Allah. So he mentions the ayah from the Quran, the ayah or two ayat which highlight and are evidences for the attribute of Allah, the face of Allah. And the first ayah is وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, that the face of your Lord, full of majesty and honor, will remain. And this ayah comes directly after the ayah كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. That ayah in the Quran, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ, indicates and tells us that everything will be destroyed. Everything will come to an end. كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. Everything that is upon the earth will come to an end and die and be finished. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, but the face of your Lord, full of majesty and honor, will remain. So the ayah highlights to us that everything on this earth will die and come to an end, but only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remain, and whatever else Allah chooses to allow to remain. There are certain things that will be exempt from coming to an end on that day, certain things that will be exempt from dying and coming to an end and finishing. From amongst them, for example, are hellfire and paradise. Hellfire and paradise remain. The throne of Allah, for example, remains. The kursi, the footstool, remains. So there are a few things that are exemptions and they will remain. But everything else, it will come to an end and it will be destroyed and die and finish. So in these ayat, the first one ends at saying, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ, that everything that is upon it will come to an end. The Salaf, they mentioned, one of the Salaf mentioned, Ash-Sha'bi, that when you recite these ayat, when you recite كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ, you should not stop on that ayah. You should continue it on with the next ayah. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, in order to make the meaning clear that everything will come to an end except the face of your Lord, full of majesty and honor, will remain. So that there is no confusion and there is no way of reading that which could lead to an incorrect understanding. If you were to stop on the first ayah, كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ, everything will come to an end, without the next ayah with it, then maybe a person is whispered to with whisperings that are incorrect. So Ash-Sha'bi mentioned, when you come to this ayah, recite it together with the next ayah, so that it all makes sense together and clear. كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. Everything upon it will come to an end, but the face of your Lord, the mighty and honorable and majestic, will remain. So, يبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام، وهذا من فقههم في القرآن وكمال علمهم، إذا المقصود الإخبار بفناء من عليها مع بقاء وجهه. So the point of these ayat is to highlight that everything will come to an end, but the face of Allah will remain. And when we say the face of Allah will remain, then, as we have always said before, talking about the names and attributes of Allah, the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the attribute of a face. What and how, the details we do not know. The details we do not know, and we cannot start imagining the face of Allah. فَمَعْنَاهُ مَعْلُومٌ وَكَيْفِيَّتُهُ مَجْهُولٌ. The meaning is known, وَكَيْفِيَّتُهُ مَجْهُولَةٌ, but how, the description and the detail is unknown to us. لا نعلم كيف وجه الله عز وجل. We do not know how the face of Allah is. كسائر صفاته, just like all of His other attributes, we do not know how they are, and the details and the descriptions. لكننا نؤمن بأن له وجها موصوفا بالجلال والإكرام. But we believe that Allah has a face attributed with majesty and honor, a face of majesty and honor. موصوفا بالبهاء والعظمة والنور العظيم. Also mentioned is that the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has that great majesty and light. حتى قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم, to the extent that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, حجابه النور لو كشفه لأحرقت سبحات وجهه ما انتهى إليه بصره من خلقه. That if, or that the covering of Allah is light, if Allah was to expose that, if Allah was to make that visible and seen and exposed, then the light, that light, the rays of light from His face would burn everything that His sight comes to in creation. And that means everything in creation, because the sight, it covers everything in creation. Meaning therefore that if the light, the rays of light from the face of Allah, if they were exposed, the covering was removed, then everything in creation would be burnt from them. فبصره ينتهي إلى كل شيء وعليه فلو كشف هذا الحجاب حجاب النور عن وجهه لاحترق كل شيء. That if Allah was to remove the covering, then everything would be burnt because His eyesight covers everything. ولهذا نقول هذا وجه عظيم لا يمكن أبدا أن يماثل أوجه المخلوقات. So this is a great face of majesty and honor for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there is no possible comparison to anything in creation. So we affirm the attribute of the face of Allah, of majesty and honor, and we do not try to imagine how the face of Allah is. We do not try to explain the details of the face of Allah, but we believe and we affirm the attribute of the face of Allah, and there is no possibility of any comparison to be made between the face of Allah and anything in creation. فبناء على هذا نقول من عقيدتنا أننا نثبت أن لله وجها. So therefore it is from our aqidah that we affirm that Allah has a face in reality. وَنَأْخُذُهُ مِنْ قَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى, and we have understood that and taken that as an evidence from وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. The ayah tells us that everything will be destroyed, but the face of your Lord, the mighty or the majestic and honorable will remain. It should also be understood that this does not mean that the other attributes of Allah will not remain. When Allah tells us His face will remain, then what is mentioned about the attribute of the face of Allah is applicable to all of the attributes of Allah. Does not mean that the other attributes of Allah will come to an end. All of the attributes of Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remains. So it should not be understood that this is specific to the face of Allah. Rather, this is mentioning the face of Allah of majesty and honor, but within that, from the principles of Ahlul Sunnah in understanding the names and attributes, we know that all of the other attributes the same applies, that they will all remain, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of course remains, and all of His attributes remain. So we cannot compare the face of Allah to anything. نقول بأن هذا الوجه لا يماثل أوجه المخلوقين لقوله تعالى ليس كمثله شيء. And we know that the face of Allah cannot be comparable to anything in creation due to the statement of Allah in the Quran, there is nothing like unto Him. There is nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَنَجْهَلُ كَيْفِيَّةَ هَذَا الْوَجْهِ. And we don't know the details and the how of the face of Allah. And that is, just like Allah told us in the Quran, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِهِ عِلْمًا, that they do not encompass Him in knowledge. Allah has given us a limited and restricted amount of knowledge, and that knowledge is not sufficient to encompass the details and the descriptions and the how of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فإن حاول أحد أن يتصور هذه الكيفية بقلبه أو أن يتحدث عنها بلسانه قلنا إنه مبتدع ضال. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen mentions, if somebody tried to imagine the face of Allah and describe it and talk about it if someone imagined it in their heart, imagined it in themselves, and thought about what it could look like, and then tried to describe that to people, the face of Allah looks like this and looks like that. If anybody does that, we would say they are an innovator. They are misguided. They are misguided and they are an innovator. Because they are now talking about affairs that Allah has not given us knowledge of. They are talking about affairs that Allah has not given us knowledge of. قَائِلٌ عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُ. He is talking about Allah upon an affair that he does not know of. وَقَدْ حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْنَا أَن نَقُولَ عَلَيْهِ مَا لَا نَعْلَمُ. And Allah has made it haram upon us to say about Him that which we do not know. So for example, in the ayah in Surah Al-A'raf, قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَالْإِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ وَأَن تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلْ بِهِ سُلْطَانًا وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. At the end of the ayah, Allah prohibits us from أَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that you say upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that which you do not know. And anybody trying to imagine in their minds, in their hearts, what the face of Allah looks like, they are certainly going into affairs that they do not know of. Allah has not given us knowledge of that. And similarly in Al-Isra, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Again the ayah prohibiting us from delving into affairs that we have no knowledge of. So it is impermissible for a person to try to imagine the face of Allah and then describe it. We do not know that. So we affirm the attribute of the face of Allah, because Allah has affirmed that for Himself. But we do not try to imagine it or describe it. So here then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that everything will come to an end, but His face of majesty and honor will remain. And like we said, with everything coming to an end, there are certain few things, a few particular things that Allah has exempt from destruction on that day, a few things that will remain, that are mustathna min al-halak. So from those, like we mentioned before, the throne of Allah, the footstool of Allah, the fire, the hellfire, the paradise, the preserved tablet, the pen. There are a number of things that are exempt from the destruction on that day. And they are the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to allow to remain. So everything else will come to an end. فَفِي هَذِهِ الْآيَةِ كَغَيْرَبِ وَالسُّنَّةِ إثبات صفة الوجه لله سبحانه وتعالى كما يليق بجلاله وعظمته وإثبات أنه وجه حقيقة لا يشبه وجوه خلقه ليس كمثله شيء. So the ayah affirms the attribute of the face of Allah, of majesty and honor, and that it is a face in reality, and it does not compare or resemble any faces or anything in creation. وَهَذَا هُوَ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِ أَهْلُ السُّنَّةِ وَالْجَمَاعَةِ. That is the Aqidah of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah regarding the face of Allah. خِلَافًا لِلْمُبْتَدِعَةِ من الجهمية وأشباههم ممن نفى الوجه وعطله وزعم أنه مجاز عن الذات والثواب والجهة أو غير ذلك. The people of innovation were misguided once again regarding this affair. The people of innovation, like the Jahmiyyah and their likes, They rejected the face of Allah, rejected the face of Allah in affirming the attribute of the face of Allah. And they said, no, it is only a metaphor or a simile, it is only an example being given for the reward of Allah or the essence of Allah, or other than that from the types of misinterpretations that they made. منها أنه فرق بين الذات والوجه وعطف أحدهما على الآخر يقتضي المغايرة. Also from them, the evidences that refer to the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and speak about the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the evidences that highlight the face of Allah being an actual attribute separate to the other attributes. It is an actual separate attribute, and it is not something you can just misinterpret and say it means the reward of Allah or it is the essence of Allah. It is an actual separate attribute from the attributes of Allah. For example, in the hadith it mentions إِذَا دَخَلَ أَحَدُكُمُ الْمَسْجِدَ قَالَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ الْعَظِيمِ وَبِوَجْهِهِ الْكَرِيمِ, that I seek refuge in Allah, the great, the mighty, the majestic, and by His noble face and honorable and majestic face. So the essence of Allah has been mentioned, and then the face of Allah has been mentioned, indicating that the face of Allah is a specific attribute. It's not just generally the essence of Allah, such that you can reject the face. Rather, it is something separate to the essence of Allah, meaning it is an individual attribute, not the one and the same as they want to say, in order to reject the actual attribute of the face of Allah. So we'll just stop for the prayer, and then we'll carry on after the prayer, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. So we were talking about the attribute of the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we mentioned how some of the groups of innovation, they rejected the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like the Jahmiyyah and their likes, and that is from their deviance and their misguidance in not accepting what is established in the evidences. And they claimed that the face of Allah, it just means Dhatullah, that it is just the essence of Allah. But in reality, the face of Allah is an attribute mentioned by itself. And that is because when things are attributed to Allah, when things are attributed to Allah, then they are two types. Either they will be items that are independently established, items that are independently established. For example, the Kaaba. Do we not say Baytullahi? We are attributing the Kaaba to Allah, the house of Allah. Baytullahi. But the Kaaba, is it not an entity that is established by itself? It is there established. It's an entity that exists. Naqatullah, for example, the she-camel of Allah, that is also an entity that is established in and of itself. And Abdullah, when we say a person is an entity established in and of himself. And so that is the connection that you make between things to Allah in terms of those things being under the control and the possession of Allah. فهذه إضافة تشريف وتخصيص وهي إضافة مملوك إلى مالكه. So in that respect there, those items are being attributed to Allah to give honor to those items, but also because it is an example of those items being controlled and under the kingdom and dominion and control of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second type of thing that is attributed to Allah are attributes that are not entities separately, individually by themselves. They are attributed to Allah and they are not entities separately by themselves. Meaning, for example, ilmullah, the knowledge of Allah, and the hayatuhu, the life of Allah, qudratuhu, the power and ability of Allah, sam'uhu and basaruhu, his hearing and his seeing, and his light. All of these are attributes that are being attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فهذا إضافة صفة إلى موصوف بها. This is the attribution of the attribute to Allah. These are attributes attributed to Allah. So you don't say that these attributes are just the Dhatullah and we don't affirm them as attributes. Rather, they are affirmed as attributes and they are attributed to Allah, the one who is mawsufun biha, attributed with them. So this therefore means that these attributes are not created. These attributes of Allah are not created. They are attributes of Allah, and the attributes of Allah, it is the same what you say about them compared to what you say about the essence of Allah. The Dhatullah, we do not say Allah is created, and likewise we do not say His attributes are created. So the attributes of Allah and the self of Allah, none of that is created. So there are two examples there. The first example of created items under the control of Allah that are attributed to Allah as an honor for them. Baytullah, Naqatullah, Abdullah. But the second type here are the attributes of Allah that are not created. They are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are attributed to Him. They are not creations from the creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why in the hadith here there's an example mentioned, أعوذ بالله العظيم وبوجهه الكريم. And in the other one, أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات. Seeking refuge, mentioning the attributes of Allah is permissible because the attributes of Allah are not created. If they were created, is it permissible to seek refuge in something created? In this sense there, it would not be permissible. So these attributes, it is permissible, and it's mentioned in these narrations, indicating therefore the attributes of Allah are not created. The second ayah that is mentioned in this chapter, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكٌ إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ. Similar kind of ayah. It mentions in the Quran that everything will be destroyed except His face. Everything will be destroyed except His face, the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is similar to the previous ayah. فَالْمَعْنَى كُلُّ شَيْءٍ فَانٍ وَزَائِلٍ. That everything will come to an end and everything will disappear. إِلَّا وَجْهَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. Except for the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which, like we said, means not just the face of Allah, but all of the attributes of Allah. That everything will be destroyed, but Allah will remain, and all these attributes of Allah will remain. إِلَّا وَجْهَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهُ بَاقٍ. وَلِهَذَا قَالَ لَهُ الْحُكْمُ وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. فهو الحكم الباقي الذي يرجع إليه الناس ليحكم بينهم. So Allah is the one that remains, and the people, they return back to Him for the rulings and the judgments. وقيل في معنى الآية كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه. It has been mentioned regarding the tafsir of the ayah that everything will be destroyed except His face. أي إلا ما أريد به وجهه. Meaning everything except for that which was done intending the face of Allah by it. Everything will be destroyed except for that which was done sincerely. The sincere affairs will remain and everything else will be destroyed. And that is لأن سياق الآية تدل أو يدل على ذلك. ولا تدع مع الله إلها آخر لا إله إلا هو كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه. And do not call alongside Allah another God. There is no deity worthy of worship in truth except He, and everything will be destroyed except His face. So some scholars said the meaning of it is every action and every affair that was not done for the sake of Allah will come to an end and be destroyed. They will all be destroyed. But that which was done for the sake of Allah remains. كأن يقول لا تدع مع الله إلها آخر فتشرك به لأن عملك وإشراكك هالك أي ضائع سدى إلا ما أخلصته لوجه الله فإنه يبقى لأن العمل الصالح له ثواب باق لا يفنى في جنات النعيم. So some of the scholars said the context of the ayah may indicate that the tafsir is everything will come to an end except that which is done sincerely for the face of Allah, for the sake of Allah. But from the understanding of the scholars is that the first explanation is more accurate, that it's literally just talking about the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, highlighting and emphasizing the attribute of Allah, that everything will come to an end except the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is of course Allah and all of the attributes of Allah. But whichever meaning you apply, the end result is the same in terms of affirming the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because whichever way you explain it, it still affirms the attribute of the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وهو من الصفات الذاتية الخبرية التي مسماها بالنسبة إلينا أبعاض وأجزاء. So here the Shaykh, he just mentioned some of the details about the types of attributes that the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is from His attributes of essence. It is from the essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is an attribute ذاتية خبرية. And that comes into more detail later on, talking about the different types of attributes in the different categories of how you would explain the attributes. But here what we'll mention is the people of innovation, they misinterpreted this, like we said, they tried to reject this, and some of them said it just means the reward of Allah. The face of Allah does not actually mean that Allah has a face, it just means that Allah will reward the people. That is what some of them said. فَسَّرَ أَهْلُ التَّحْرِيفِ وَجْهَ اللَّهِ بِثَوَابِهِ فقالوا المراد بالوجه في الآيات الثواب كل شيء يفنى إلا ثواب الله. They said therefore the meaning is everything will come to an end except the reward of Allah. Everything comes to an end except the reward of Allah. ففسروا الوجه الذي هو صفة كمال فسروه بشيء مخلوق بائن عن الله قابل للعدم والوجود فالثواب حادث بعد أن لم يكن وجائز أن يرتفع ولولا وعد الله ببقائه. So really they have downgraded the explanation of the attribute of Allah. They've downgraded it from an attribute of Allah that is not created, the face of Allah, to saying it is the reward of Allah. And the reward of Allah, it is separate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it can exist and it may not exist. Was it not for the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised its existence and its remaining nature? So they have downgraded it, saying that it is the reward of Allah. The reward of Allah is something separate from Allah, whereas the face of Allah is an attribute of Allah, not created. So they deviated and they have gone against the ijma' of the Salaf. They have gone against the ijma' of the Salaf. فَمَا مِنَ السَّلَفِ أَحَدٌ قَالَ إِنَّ الْمُرَادَ بِالْوَجْهِ الثَّوَابِ. There is not a single one from the Salaf who ever said that the face of Allah, the meaning of it is the reward of Allah. وهذه كتبهم بين أيدينا مزبورة محفوظة أخرجوا لنا نصا عن الصحابة وعن أئمة التابعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان أنهم فسروا هذا التفسير لن تجدوا إلى ذلك سبيلا أبدا. Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen says, tell them, bring us an evidence. Bring us even a single statement from the companions when they ever said that the face of Allah means the reward of Allah, and you will not find even a single evidence saying that. This section then, it only has those two ayat as the examples that Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala used to emphasize and to highlight and to make clear the Aqidah of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah regarding this attribute, that we affirm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a face. We do not have any understanding of the details and the descriptions of the face of Allah though, but we know that Allah has a face in reality that does not resemble the face of anything in creation. No resemblance to anything in creation in any way. And if a person tries to imagine the face of Allah and describe it, then he has fallen into innovation, has fallen into misguidance and deviance in attempting to describe the face of Allah. And this is what some of the people of innovation attempt to accuse Ahlus Sunnah of. They say, if you are affirming a face to Allah, that means you must be imagining what Allah looks like. And it does not mean that at all. You affirm that Allah has a face in reality because Allah affirmed that for Himself in the Quran. But we do not try to imagine or describe it at all. So we are not imagining that, and you are not to imagine that, and you are not to try and think and describe that. So we do not do that. We affirm that Allah has a face because Allah affirmed He has a face. Beyond that, we do not try to imagine or describe anything. So it is a misguidance from the people of innovation who try to claim and put this accusation upon Ahlul Sunnah that you're imagining what Allah looks like. Rather, we're saying we affirm what Allah affirmed for Himself. You are the ones who are rejecting what Allah affirmed for Himself. We will affirm what Allah affirmed for Himself in the Quran, because Allah is more knowledgeable of Himself than anyone else. Allah has affirmed these attributes, we will affirm them. Allah has not given us details and descriptions of how those attributes are, so we will not get into that. We will affirm them, but not get into anything that Allah has not given us knowledge of. So we affirm the face of Allah upon reality, but we do not go into the issues of descriptions and details and imagining what the face of Allah looks like. The next chapter is regarding the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that chapter will begin with the next time. And there's a bit more detail in that one, because then it is about the hand. Is it a right hand, left hand? And some discussions are mentioned and some evidences are mentioned regarding that. And also the people of innovation and their deviations in claiming that the hands of Allah are something else. So we'll come to that topic next week, insha'Allah ta'ala, regarding the hands of Allah. What time is Isha next week? Alright, so we'll try to begin at 6:30 p.m. Next week we'll begin at 6:30 p.m. insha'Allah. And then we'll be able to try and get the lesson completed before the prayer. So insha'Allah 6:30 p.m. next week. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.